Okay, class. So for the first lesson today, we're going to address another objection to utilitarianism that Mill considers. And this is an objection from the Kantian perspective in particular. We've at least hinted at Kant's objections along these lines. And we'll see how Mill tries to reply to it. And we'll see how he introduces this notion of secondary principles to add alongside the utility principles and how those are supposed to work. Before we get to that, I want to introduce two more ideas from that movement we talked about last time, the Scottish Enlightenment. And these are ideas that are, I think, now quite prevalent in people's understandings of ethics. And they'll help to explain how Mill addresses this objection. So the first one is common sense. We use this term all the time. If you think about what is common sense, it's the sort of sense or ideas or understanding that we all hold in common. And the founders of the Scottish Enlightenment, people like David Hume and Adam Smith, people like Bentham and James Mill, they all believed that when we talk about reason and what it is to apply reason or be a reasonable person, they thought that this doesn't mean what it meant for Kant, something like pure logic, pure reasoning that could be worked out, say, in an academic setting where you kind of work out all of ethics using pure reason alone. They thought instead that human beings tend to have fairly similar experiences, and we have the kind of mind that can synthesize those experiences. We talk to each other, and we come up with a kind of common understanding of things. And so one place this plays out is in ethics. They thought that people, for the most part, have a commonsensical understanding about what is right and wrong in life. Now, there's always those outliers. There's always those few people who, either due to some sort of insanity or just because they're an incredible jerk, don't share our common understandings of right or wrong. But for the most part, they thought those are outliers, and that most of the world's population shares some really basic understandings about things like right or wrong. They also had a belief of human sympathy that they also thought was nearly universal. They thought that most people care about their fellow human beings, including fellow human beings that they don't even know, strangers, including ones that live on the other side of the world. The members of the Scottish Enlightenment thought that for the most part, it's a sort of built-in part of human life to have some sense of sympathy for our fellow human beings. And again, there are outliers. There's always those people, either through some sort of mental illness or just because they're that kind of rare, incredible jerk who don't care about others and who have no sympathy. But they think, for the most part, though, those are outliers. And most of humanity has a shared sense in which we care about each other. And we at least care about people suffering, right? We don't like to hear about, and we don't want to cause suffering of other people, including strangers. So they thought it's really based on these two things that you get ethics, right? It comes from common understandings that you have, plus a sympathy that you have for all others, and they think from that derives what you might call kind of commonsensical morality. And as I mentioned before, this is what Mill wants to show utilitarianism as. He wants to say that common sense of morality that we all have, deep down, that is based on pleasure and pain. It is utilitarianism, right? And I'll try to explain that a little bit further today. But they also use these things as a contrast and as a critique of thinkers like Kant. Mill, in the beginning of the book Utilitarianism, calls out Kant by name, and he says, look, he has tried to establish an ethics using pure reason alone, in which no amount of feeling or desire or experiences plays a part, as if you can, using reason and logic alone, drive an ethics. But Mill says that doesn't work at all. Even people who think that they're doing Kant's categorical imperative tests, they are actually smuggling in and using a lot of their common experiences, common sense, and they're often using their fellow sympathy for others, those feelings, that desire you have that other people not suffer. He thinks all of that's also informing those answers that you get when you apply the categorical imperative test. Okay, so now let's get to the objection that Mill is facing here. And this is, you'll find this on that second page in the Mill sheet, that first quote is what we'll talk about today. And that what I've given you there is actually just the reply. So let's talk through the objection first of all. The way that Mill phrases this objection is, how does anybody have time to calculate net utility prior to acting? Right? How do you have time to think about all the possible consequences of your action and then add up all the ways that your action will bring about pleasure and then subtract from that all the ways that your action might bring about pain, and thereby you get a utility calculus. The way that Mill phrases his objection is, it's a matter of time in which, how is it, I'm about to steal that bag of chips, I'm walking out of the 7-Eleven, right? Do I really have time to think about what are all the consequences of this action? Well, it's going to make me happy by eating the chips. It's going to make the person behind the counter unhappy if he finds out I stole the chips. Then there's the people who own the store or invest in the store. I wonder what approximately is the effect of me stealing this bag of chips on their happiness, right? And then Mill would also say that's not all those are not the only people to consider here, because when I steal things, I am bringing down the net level of trust in humanity by a little bit, and that's important to bring in mind too. But the question is, do I really have time to go through that whole calculus and to really get a good answer prior to walking out the door or putting the chips back? So that's the objection as Mill phrases it. We've hinted at this before when we talked about Kant's problem with people trying to rely on consequences and ethics based on consequences, right? Let's talk about the way that Kant would phrase this objection is actually quite a bit stronger than the way Mill would do it. Kant is not so much concerned with the idea that there's not time to make such a calculus. Kant would say, you can't make such a calculus at all. It's impossible. Why? Because the kind of knowledge you would need is impossible for humans to have. Kant would say, the only way you could run through something like a utility calculus would be to know in advance what all of the future consequences of your action are. But what human being can know in advance what all those consequences might be? It seems like you would have to know the future in order to be able to run through the utility principle test, right? But since no human being knows the future, since we don't know the impact of any given action, right, there's simply no way of calculating net utility. That's the objection from Kant's perspective. And in contrast, Kant would say, and we saw him say this, what you can know in advance, given a mere moment of reflection, is whether your will accords with the rational law. You see, that doesn't require that you know anything about what will happen from your action. It doesn't require that you know anything about the consequences and everybody affected by that and how they respond and how their happiness goes up or down, right? All you need to know is there a contradiction within my will right now when I'm about to steal that bag of chips, right? And so Kant would say that kind of knowledge of whether your intention matches a rational law, is the kind of thing, because it rests on pure reason, you can know in advance, right? And upon a moment's reflection, you can calculate correctly whether that action is right or wrong. But Kant would say there's simply no way of doing that with something like consequentialism, utilitarianism, where you're trying to know in the future what the distant and varied consequences of your action are. Okay, so that's the objection in the kind of somewhat weaker form that Mill puts it in, having to do with time, and the stronger form that Kant puts it in. Now let's try to see how Mill responds to this. Okay, and he begins with an analogy, and let's look at that quote on your sheet. The analogy that Mill gives is he says, this is kind of like objecting to the idea that sailors can navigate the seas based on the study of the stars, on astronomy, since how do they have time if they're out there on the ocean to map out the stars and calculate and draw star charts and be able to calculate where they are, longitude and latitude, right? And so the objection would be, look, when you're a sailor and you're out there on the high seas, you can't be just kind of gazing at the stars and slowly mapping them out and then slowly accumulating all that knowledge to figure out where you are. And therefore, navigation can't possibly be based on astronomy. But Mill says, this is an utterly foolish objection, because it assumes that sailors wait until they get on the seas in order to make these sorts of calculations. But he says this is not the case. They have what's called a nautical almanac, which would be a chart of the stars and a way of calculating based on the position of those stars where your ship is, right? And he says they go to sea with that already in hand, such that they don't have to spend any time prior to steering the ship, mapping out all the stars and making these charts. They go aboard the ship in the first place with that almanac, with that knowledge at hand, right? So that's what he's saying. Nobody argues that the art of navigation is not founded on astronomy, because sailors cannot wait to calculate the nautical almanac. Being rational creatures, they go to sea with it ready calculated. Okay, so that's his analogy. Now let's see how that plays out in terms of ethics. Right? The idea is parallel to that nautical almanac that a sailor goes to sea with. He thinks each person already goes out into life with a commonsensical sense of what is right or wrong. Right? And so this is the next line. He says, all rational creatures go out upon the sea of life with their minds made up on the common questions of right and wrong. Right? So he thinks it's not the case that I'm kind of there at the door of the 7-Eleven with a bag of chips stuffed over my coat, and now I'm wondering, I wonder what are all the possible consequences of this action. He thinks even before I went into 7-Eleven, by common sense and by human sympathy, I knew it was wrong to steal. Right? I walked into the store already knowing that. Right? So that's his analogy, is that ethics, by common sense and human sympathy, each one of us kind of already know common rules of ethics. We all know we shouldn't steal, we shouldn't lie, we shouldn't kill, etc. Right? And he calls these subordinate or secondary principles. And so these will be rules of conduct, things like don't lie, don't steal, don't kill. And as I'll explain in a minute, he thinks these are ultimately derived from the utility principle, right, and justified by the utility principle. But he thinks you don't need to calculate utility before each action you're undertaking. You can simply rely on these secondary principles that are themselves derived from the utility principle. So he explains the relationship between the secondary principles and the utility principle by way of a kind of a genealogy of morals, a kind of history of where did we get these ethical rules, right? We all know that we shouldn't lie, steal, or kill, but where did those rules come from? Mill tells this story. He says, initially, human beings began to notice what sort of actions tended to promote pleasure or happiness, and what sorts of actions tended to do the reverse. What sorts of actions tend to make people unhappy or cause pain. And he says, we kind of accumulated that knowledge into a kind of common sense. And over time, we said, look, when people lie, it tends to create painful situations, right? It tends to decrease overall happiness. So eventually we gave ourselves the rule, don't lie, right? Same thing with stealing, right? We over noticing for many generations that stealing tends to make the net amount of happiness lower, right? And tends to increase the amount of pain that humanity suffers. We eventually put that wisdom, that common sense, into a simple rule, don't steal. Okay? So he thinks this is where we got those rules. And he thinks that over time, we eventually forgot that the reason why we're not supposed to lie, steal, kill, etc., is because it tends to decrease net happiness or increase net pain. He thinks over time, we didn't really need to know where we derived these from, right? And we didn't need to remember anymore that these things create, that breaking these rules creates pain, and that keeping them creates happiness. He thinks, eventually we just accepted these as the rules of morality. Okay, and in a way, he's fine with that, because these things are still based on utility. They're still based on what things maximize happiness and minimize pain. It doesn't matter whether people using these secondary principles know that they're based on utilitarianism or not. Okay, but this is his way of showing that common morality, these things like don't lie, don't steal, don't kill, he thinks they did derive from the utility principle, and that therefore each person who's using these common rules, deep down, they are utilitarians, whether they know they are or not, or at least their ethics is based on the utility principle, whether anybody's aware of it or not, right? And of course, since Mill doesn't so much care about intentions, right, he doesn't care whether the people who are acting in ways that follow these rules know that they are utilitarians, and he doesn't care that they have no intention of raising net happiness by following these rules, or refraining from decreasing net happiness by breaking them, right? Because that's a matter of intention. He just cares that you follow the rules, and thereby the result would be the same, right? That following these rules will make people happier, breaking them will make people less happy. Okay? So when Mill introduces these secondary or subordinate principles, he understands them as following from the utility principle. And this is that last sentence in that quote there. He says, "Whatever we adopt as the fundamental principle of morality, we require subordinate principles to apply it by." And so the way he's thinking of it is, let's suppose we adopt as our fundamental principle of morality the utility principle, that an action is right if it maximizes happiness, wrong if it does the reverse. He says, to apply that in action, it's not the case that you have to every time apply that principle itself. It's much easier to apply the secondary principles that follow from it. Things like don't lie, don't steal, don't kill, right? So when I'm there at the door of 7-Eleven with a bag under my coat, right, it's much easier for me to simply say, oh yeah, I shouldn't steal, put it back, right, than it is for me to say, what are all the net consequences of my action, right? And will it bring about a net increase of happiness or the reverse? You see, you don't need to go through that complicated calculus, the utility calculus itself. You can rely on the secondary principles, right, that are derived from it. And this, because Mill says this, later thinkers have made this distinction. This is not exactly Mill's terminology, but they've said it seems then that there's a distinction between two different types of utilitarianism, or two different ways of applying the utilitarian idea. The first of which is known as act utilitarianism, and that's when you apply the utility principle itself to each action. And that's the kind of utilitarianism that we learned last time, and the kind that you apply to the examples in your reflections. Right, so act utilitarianism would be the one in which you apply the utility principle in order to tell whether that action is right or wrong. Okay, but it seems like what he's now introducing with this idea of secondary or subordinate principles is what people sometimes call rule utilitarianism, in which you can apply these secondary principles or rules, things like don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal, and that's what you need to apply to each action. And you don't need to go back to the utility principle unless you're wondering, why is it the case that I should follow these secondary rules, right? So let's suppose I'm at the door and I'm thinking, oh yeah, I shouldn't steal. And then I wonder, well, why shouldn't I steal, right? Then I might think, oh yeah, because stealing makes people unhappy on average and overall. Why should I buy this thing honestly? Because that tends to promote net happiness. You see that? So if I'm wondering about these secondary principles, about where they come from, right, then I can go back to the utility principle. But Mill thinks, for the most part, you don't need to do that, right? You can simply rely on these secondary, commonsensical rules of morality. Okay, so that's what rule utilitarianism is. And let's see how that would play out in some of the examples. So, I talked about the stealing of chips. Let's talk about something like cheating on the midterm exam, right? If I apply act utilitarianism, I'm going to say, what are all the impacts of me cheating on that exam? Right? Who is it going to make happy? Who is it going to make unhappy? And I run through the utility calculus test, right? Many of you were exactly correct in indicating that, yeah, it might be that I'm making myself a little bit more happy, right? But probably by putting my fellow students at a disadvantage, I might be making them less happy, right? I might be making the professor less happy. Other of you thought about things like, what about the fact that if I get ahead by cheating, I might be, let's suppose I get into the best medical school because I cheated my way in there, right? And now I'm a doctor and people trust me, but I cheated my way there, right? Think about all of the likely cases where I'm dispensing, maybe I'm not even kind of guilty of malpractice, but I'm probably not as good of a doctor as one who didn't cheat to get there, right? And yet I'm getting the best jobs. Right? And so you have to think about all those patients that I'd be treating with a lesser quality of care, right? That would also go into the utility principle. So in other words, there's a lot that would go into figuring this out. But let's suppose instead I apply rule utilitarianism, and I simply say, oh yeah, there's a rule, you're not supposed to cheat. Boom, that's it. That's all I need to know. It's a commonsensical rule. You shouldn't cheat on an exam, and therefore I know that action is wrong. You see that? So it's just simply two different ways of applying utility, one directly and one indirectly through these secondary rules. Okay, so for your reflections today, the first thing I want you to reflect on is this idea of human sympathy. Do you agree with these Scottish Enlightenment thinkers like Mill that for the most part, people have a basic level of human sympathy for each other, such that we care about the suffering of others, including the suffering of strangers, right? Or are you more like Kant, who suspects that deep down we are all so self-interested that we don't actually care about each other? And that while we might care about people who are close to us, for the most part, we don't care about strangers, right? And it's only a sort of objective ethics that gets us to put aside our own self-interest that would get us to care about strangers, right? Which is it that you agree with? Do we have this human sympathy for the most part, or instead are we mostly lacking in human sympathy and merely pursuing our own self-interests? That's the first question. The second question is, do you agree with this idea of commonsensical rules of morality? Things like don't lie, don't steal, don't cheat, don't kill. Do you agree that those are there? And then more importantly, do you agree with Mill that since those are there, we don't need to calculate utility from the beginning, and we can simply trust in those rules in order to act, and that therefore this objection that you don't have the knowledge you need to go through utility calculus is proven to be false, that we do have the knowledge, the commonsensical knowledge of these secondary rules, and therefore we go into each action already knowing what we need to do. Is that the case, that we go into each action already knowing what's right or wrong? Right? Or do you think that it needs to be calculated rationally with some sort of more complicated calculus?